Hello and welcome to the great white north, your destination for the iciest cold takes from the frozen wastelands of the north. I'm your host, Charles Constantine, and with me is NP. Say hello, NP.
Hello.
How's it going this week?
Pretty good overall. Well, I mean, work's actually a misery these days. But
Oh, really?
oh man, uh, yeah. Well, I got boss problems.
Oh, see, I got the opposite. I got boss, whatever the opposite of problems is. Not solutions, I guess, but good stuff from the boss. One of the
what's your
bosses.
boss doing?
Man, I like just the other day I had a discussion with him. Like we were just talking. I don't know. Somehow I got into like politics stuff and kind of hitting some marks here and there. And I think we started like something along the lines of like the land acknowledgement stuff. And he was saying like how silly it is. He's talking about how like in interviews, like they expect you to do a land acknowledgement before every single interview. Like this interview is being conducted on treaty whatever land. And he's like, yeah, this is dumb and it's patronizing. And then I got into conversation. I'm like, yeah, you're right, it is patronizing. Like, hey, he's like, yeah, this is a group of people that like they got beat, they get their asses beat, and then you're sitting there like, oh yeah, like you guys can pretend like you're okay, like you're doing all right. But that's all we're gonna do for you. Like we're just gonna say, hey, you're doing
Yeah.
okay. You got this land. We'll say that it's your land, but you don't actually have any self determination.
Wow. It sounds like we might have a new guest.
Yeah,
Like we've
then it's
covered
just
that topic in depth. I think maybe a couple times, but
but yeah, like I touched on that with him too, and I'm like, yeah, no, the whole thing's stupid. It's all performative, and like they I pointed out like, hey, they put in more effort to attack people who won't even say some stupid land acknowledgement than they will to actually help anyone from that group of people. It's like, yeah, these people still have like shit conditions on their reserve and no clean drinking water, and he's right when he says that. Um,
I resent
but
the drinking water comment. That's completely their own doing. I used to do well. I won't say more than that. Simply put, I've been in those. I've built those water plants, and they
yeah,
simply
and I've had some discussions with some guys that are like, yeah, no, they're given certain things, they can't maintain it. But I think that's part of the problem too, is this assumption that you can just give them, here's all these like technological advancements and like here's a society, and we're just gonna leave you to it and leave it at that. And then when things are bad, then we'll use you as a pawn for our liberal talking points, and just leave you as that pawn, and we'll pretend like it's social structures are the reason that these people can't fit in to this new development, when in reality it's just like this is a group of people that like are different. They're just a different group of people, and instead of acknowledging those inherent differences, they'll just continue to allow that problem to stew. And like I was talking with one of my bosses, like, no, they'll be happy to attack people for not following line on the narrative surrounding the people, but they'll just kind of leave the problem there without acknowledging what's causing the problem, right? So that's kind of where I see it. Anyways, we kept going on in the discussion, and somehow it got into I don't know, it got into like Israel stuff. Oh yeah, it was like the Middle East. So
oh
he's talking about how like it's time to. He's like, there's no reason to be in the Middle East. Like, just get out of that area. Let those people deal with each other. Like, who's benefiting?
mm-hmm.
All that money's going to waste. I'm like, well, I mean, with the Israel lobby and how much influence that Israel lobby has in America, of course you're going to stay in the Middle East. Got to destabilize it to keep Israel safe. And he's like, oh yeah, no, you're right there. And then he starts going on saying like, you know, these Israelis, like they'll keep using the Holocaust narrative to, he's like, they keep using that. Meanwhile, they're just committing all these atrocities against the Palestinians. And he's like if you guys want to complain about that Holocaust, then you better stop doing what you're doing, because and then we go on like, well, they always say never again, and then, well, what are they doing right now? And just had a good like 30-minute conversation on that topic with him, and yeah, he just had no.
Is your boss Mike Enoch? That's awesome.
No, it was great to see, but like these are the kind of conversations that I don't know, for me at least, you can just kind of have them with average people. Like, it's not like a lot of the stuff is taboo and hard to understand. Like, we even got onto, he said something about, oh yeah, people should, it's kind of like a libtard thing where it's like, well, people should just be able to decide what societies they like best and go there. And, instead of having all these people that hate the societies they're in, they just go to the places that they like. And like, well, hold on there a second, man. Like, if someone really likes Japan and they want to move to Japan, but they're not Japanese, like, what's going to happen over time? Like, what's the reason Japan is the way Japan is? Is it, it's because the people are Japanese. So what's going to happen when
except
there's no Japanese there anymore? People move in there because they like the way Japan is, and that's the result of the Japanese people. And he's like, oh yeah, you're right there, I guess. So there's still some libtarded stuff in the mix, but I think if you find yourself talking to just average guys, and this doesn't mean like, the kind of people that you'd meet at a university, it's more so like just your kind of working class dudes, you'll find you can have a lot of these conversations. Because I even found this talking to some old buddies that I used to play sports with, a couple of years back. Had a kind of reunion with them, and like, those guys were just being racist. They had no barriers to racism anymore. That was all gone. You're just hanging out with your buddies that you thought they were your typical normies on these subjects, and then now you can just open up and just egg them on, even, right?
I've always felt that a lot of this this normie talk was a lot like it's like the sheeple. It's like how the bitch boomers talk about sheeple. Well, yeah, it's just not so. Like, yeah, they don't know a lot of the basis or facts or whatever, but this idea that you're going to go to jail if you mention to someone that you don't like Israel, it's a gross exaggeration. It's absolutely true. If you have a blue check mark or any amount of power, or if you're on TV or something, they'll come try and destroy you. Mm-hmm. But I guess that's what's nice about being a pro, is that no one really, like, unless you say it on Twitter, no one's gonna give a shit. You can do what you want.
Yeah, and I think in these spheres, a lot of people miss that, because I don't know, when you get stuck in the online discourse so much, you have this, you start to like get this crystallization of a notion and like what's actual acceptable discourse. Because what you're seeing online is the censorship for certain ideas, and people getting attacked for certain beliefs and trying to get them fired for their jobs. But most people aren't in those discussions online. They're not where that discourse is taking place. They don't even see it. Right. To the extent they're online, it's just within their like 300 friends in their typical social group. And like when you call like someone a normie, you're just talking about that average group of people that's not too invested in any of this, all this bullshit that we're invested in, right? And when you let that view of the world crystallize, you completely forget that there's millions of people just out there living life, adapting to the situations in front of them, right? In those moments. So you can pretend like, okay, people are, they're never going to wake up, and they're completely blind to the world around them. And they have all these like, censorship, programming that's put into them. But then reality is you go and you have a good conversation around some of these topics, and you don't be like some weird edgy spurg about things. You just have a kind of semi-rational discourse. You just shoot the shit, just be a normal guy with them. And well, what do you know? They're pretty amenable to anything you say.
Yeah. Well, I said it on the Canada Day stream. People care a lot more about how you treat them than what you believe.
Well, right. And I think that's one thing that gets missed a lot is if you actually put some effort into being a respectable person in society, And that doesn't mean you have to be libtard's version of respectable. It means like respectable in just what the standard sense, for history has been.
Would your buddies ask you to come help frame their house?
Yeah, yeah, or just be somewhat like charming and charismatic, and it doesn't mean like being some like weird guy that reads self-improvement books on how to behave a certain way. It just means like a guy who can hang out with friends.
Okay, but like you're now discriminating against me and my autist brethren. I had to learn some of this shit by rote.
Okay, I learned some of the stuff too, but like when you're with your buddies,
I know, yeah.
You can just be a guy with your
course.
buddies, and like it's just, I don't know. I think people in this kind of sphere make it a lot harder than it needs to be, because
yes,
for whatever reason, they're just not with the general public enough.
They're too online. Well,
and that's really like stunting your growth. Like I think there's a lot of potential in, again, being a normal guy, being a respectable guy in your local circles. Doesn't have to be our guys. It can just be like buddies, just have normal friends, and you can get them on board with most of what they need to be on board with. You don't need to get them to be like, 20th century revisionists on everything and like have this deep understanding of third positionism or whatever your niche ideology is at the moment. Like they're going to be on board. I think the biggest barrier really for most of these discussions is the concept of negative freedom, right? Like most of these guys are going to get hung up once you get to the point of trying to oppose certain things. Because when you say, okay, well, this shouldn't be taught to our kids, or these sort of people shouldn't be around our kids, something like that, or even these sort of people just shouldn't be displaying certain things in society, they're going to be like, well, I mean, I like having the freedom to do what I want, and if it's my personal decision, it should be okay, right? Like they always get hung up on that. So that would be the one sort of metaphysical concept that you would have to work your way around. Everything else,
I think you might be generalizing too much on that. Maybe you hit that one a few times. Yeah, I find, like, I remember walking into the office once and my coworkers asking me if I was conservative, and I said no. I don't really want to vote them out. I'd rather something, right? You can imagine what. It was more of a lamppost than a Fed post. And they're just like, yeah, like they had no problem with and then
Right.
I've also had this one lots, but like they might say, well, as long as they keep it in their bedrooms or as two consenting adults or whatever, and I'll go like, yeah, but they haven't, have they? So it looks like we're gonna have to reel that back a bit. And they'll be like, yeah. I don't know. It depends. You're probably right to some extent. I just think that it's how you present that one.
That's true. One issue that people might run into, I think the reason this sort of average guy gets hung up on in that particular notion of things is sort of a self-defense. And I don't mean self-defense in like a legal self-defense situation. I mean like defending their ability to do what they want, right?
Yeah, if you accidentally hit their
they still want to have their freedom to be. They still want to be hedonists, right?
If you start with we should ban weed, you're instantly going to have a lot of detractors.
You're going to miss the mark on that. But some of them will extrapolate that notion of like, hey, this degenerate behavior we don't want around. Well, they want their level of degeneracy, and like obviously you shouldn't be jumping in there saying no, you can't be degenerate, but you just have to realize that that's what's probably they're going to be hung up on, and that's the one thing that's you can't just change on the spot, but you can be the example.
Mm-hmm.
And I guess to finish it up, like when we talk about being a good example and being a respectable guy, that means that you also have to be willing to abstain from that hedonism yourself. And I think that's something that guys like to try and especially in these spheres, and we've already talked about it before with like the Coomers online, especially in that BAP sphere, for example.
Yeah.
They're always trying to justify just little bits and pieces of the hedonism so that you can, you can have your cake and eat it too. You can kind of be resistant, but then also indulge so that you don't feel like a loser according to the liberal standards.
Right.
That's basically what it amounts to.
Actually,
So
our buddy August
yeah.
August Benley on Twitter's has a poll up right now about cocaine use.
Oh yeah, I saw that one.
Yeah, similar thing.
So I guess it's just a couple things to keep in mind is that just be a normal guy with the average person. You can open up good dialogues with them. You can probably have them as allies. They can probably mostly be on your side, but you also have to be a positive example at the end of the day if you really want to see the change cement.
Yeah. Well, no one's gonna, a lot of the guys are also very young. It's very hard to be taken seriously when you're 20 by anyone.
Yeah, that's very true.
It gets gradually better with time, partially because of just a natural bias. Like we think older people are wiser, like naturally. It's probably not. I don't think it's true, but sometimes it can be. But it certainly has a lot of intrinsic social value to being older. But also, you'll probably iron out a lot of the more jarring bits of your personality as you get older.
Yeah, that's true too.
I know I did. I was insufferable. Probably still am, but it's on a downward curve, I hope. No, I get along good now. If you're a 19 or 20-year-old, think you're NGMI, you might still make it.
Well, I think if you're at 19 or 20 and you even have this notion of making it or not making it, you're probably going to make it, honestly. Like most guys at that age aren't even conceiving of the potentiality of not making it. They don't have any thought towards the future for themselves,
I think,
or for society at all. So if you're already thinking about that, you're already in the right mindset to make change in the first place.
Yeah. If you want to be respected by older guys in the work trailer, whatever, good piece of advice, shut the fuck up. Yep. When you're that young. And then that doesn't mean never talk. It just means don't say the thoughts that come to your head. Speak carefully.
And don't do stupid shit. Because this, actually, going back to my own work, just the other day, some guy, he's not even a young guy. He's like, what, 36 now? But he's young compared to some of the other guys, like some of the boomers. And this dude literally just grabbed a thing of chips off of one of the tables in the lunchroom and just ate the whole thing. And then so this sort of, I think 70-year-old boomer guy's walking around like, hey, who ate my chips? What? And finally got to this guy that just ate the chips off the table. And he asked him, hey, man, did you eat my chips? And the guy that ate them, he's like, yep. Just like no remorse. Didn't say sorry. Like, I ate those chips.
They're going to find you on a frack tower in your own safety harness, And
it just blew my mind. Like, what world is this guy living in? Felt like calling, what world's this kid living in? But he's 10 years older than me.
What did the 70-year-old guy do?
Well,
did he dress him down or?
Well, he didn't do it. He's like, okay, this guy's on my radar now.
Yeah. It's
just don't do stupid shit like that. Like it's not that hard.
That's actually extremely easy not to be that dumb. Well, for most people. If you are that dumb, then just apply what I said about shutting up.
Yep.
But just for everything, just try and sit still. Try and stay out of trouble. It's tough to suck it up. You get so bored when you're young. You know, you got so many thoughts running through your head. The world's so slow compared to you. Gotta,
Yeah.
you know, time and place. You got to get that out of your system. Some like go box, go go run
Yeah, you
around.
should be. Yeah, when you're that age, I don't know. I think guys should still be in there, in your team sport or something, being a part of something like that, so that you at least have something getting your aggression and your energy out. Because
I went to party at that was a disaster ultimately to get that out of my system. Uh, don't don't do that. Uh, but the only other alternative then is exercise of some kind.
yeah, aggressive exercise.
Anyway, we always end up sermonizing, uh, which is good because we're right and you got it. If you feel like you're being sermonized to, you're the guy who needs it. Um,
Exactly. Couldn't have said it better myself. We are right.
Hey, okay, let's move on to the next thing. Some people who aren't right, which is to say, the
This
sick.
Brampton thing, right?
Yeah, yeah. Most of you would have seen this article. It got shared around a lot just because of the. Can we put up what's that classic tweet? The Dravidian riding in and saying
Oh yeah,
namaste.
yeah, yeah.
No, they're saying nam.
What was he? To in Lord Indra or something like that crossed the banks.
When Lord Indra first crossed the Ganges,
Yeah,
took and slaughtered 100.
6 million Hindus or something like that.
Yeah.
What do you say? I don't remember the whole quote.
Whatever.
And his first words were "Namaste."
That's right. Anyway, so we're getting said namaste to pretty fucking hard here. It seems these really what's the word I'm looking for?
Yeah,
Arrogant people with their Bluetooths and their pizza delivery jobs are trying to tell us that they're happy that Canada's now their little corner of it. Brampton is now like India, except for the free healthcare and roads.
yeah. They in this article they call it Bramladesh or Singdale.
It sounds like something we'd call it to make fun of
Yeah,
it.
but they're calling. That's literally what I thought. I'm like, is this some like racist name they're calling out? But no, it's literally what they're calling themselves.
Wow. Yeah, it's we've covered it before when there was that not selfish, the that university girl who came here and bitched out the
No, yeah,
our
yeah. It was some like Indian, trad cath or something like that.
yeah, a few episodes ago.
And yeah. So this is along the same lines. Yeah.
Sorry, I can see my audio's periodically glitching out just a little bit here. I apologize for that. I think I'm overloading it with my booming voice. The I want these people to go home, but barring that, I look forward to seeing their enclave just turn into India, straight up India, not with the free healthcare and roads. It will inevitably just wind up as India. That's not good for us, but at least it's kind of like cosmic justice.
Yeah. It's one of these things that like it's such a mask off thing, and they're just blatantly admitting what's happening, and no one really has any problem with it. So like in this article describing this whole thing, they're talking about how like the Canadian Tire, the staff there just speak to everyone in Punjabi, right? They have
Mm-hmm.
no problem just implementing their entire cultural framework into the structures built by us. And this is one of those things that like the sort of libtard framing is going to say, okay, well, this is a good thing because these people get to come here and they get to keep their culture at the same time. But undergirding all of this, you have this notion of, okay, we're getting replaced in our own country. Our spaces are being taken by these people, and they'll deny that in the same breath. They'll say, well, this is good that these cultures are coming here and keeping everything, but also there is no replacement happening. Like, where are they pushing you out? And in this article, it says that white families are like, was, in Brampton,
moved away.
basically, yeah, exactly, moved out. They were overwhelmed.
Well, it also mentions the other minorities did too, like literally everybody.
Yeah.
Just
And
like India.
That's another point to touch on too. We'll get to that in a second. But like, literally, you push these people out of the homes that they probably have been in, probably lived in this. Some of these people for couple centuries now. It's been built up by a certain group of people over time, these founding stock Canadians, and now it's turned into an enclave of people from another country who have just implemented their own values in a completely different spot. So the question is, well, why are you there? Like, what reason did you come here if you just want to be the same people in a different spot?
And they say it in the article. It's for the free healthcare.
Exactly. They said that it's just like our hometown, or just like our home country, except we have all these nice things that were set up by the white people. And that's really what it is. That's what they're admitting in the article. And it'd be one thing if they pretended, if they just were openly admitted, like, hey, we like what you have, and that's what we're here for. But they're pretending like it's just a natural process of modern life. Like, you just get to go where you want in the world and just take what other people have. And that's okay, because you're bringing this positivity of diversity.
There's another really funny angle throughout the whole article.
Yeah.
Which is, at one point, they're bragging about all the Indian, like Jagmeet Singh and blah, blah, blah.
Yeah.
So, and then in the next breath, they're saying how oppressed they are, or how much racism there is. And like, because our car insurance is higher, stuff like this. Of course, their car insurance is higher because they're a bunch of fucking scammy Indians. Car insurance fraud is like, I forget what I think it even says in the article. It's like 10 times higher than the national average or something. There was a case in Calgary, this would have been 8 years ago probably, where they were finding, there was entire gangs, like this entire con with multiple groups running it, getting into traffic accidents on purpose for various insurance scams.
Yeah, and that's the exact kind of thing that will just get pushed under the table and never touched on. And it's funny, they describe this community that's being established here as an ethno-burb. Like this is a suburb that they've turned into an ethnic enclave. And this is the kind of thing that we talk about needing to do for us.
Yeah.
But when we talk about needing to do this, when we say, hey, well, maybe white people need their own ethnic enclaves, because like
we assume we'd be paying for our own enclave.
Yeah. But that's completely, that's a third rail. You can't touch that topic.
Right.
You can't be white. Well, white people, you have all the privilege already. So do not even think about, having your own ethnic enclaves, being with your own people. But these people can come across the world and set up whatever they want here. That's perfectly fine. And you know what? I wouldn't necessarily have as much of a problem if they were just honest about the whole process, right? Like, okay, yeah, you people, you can say, like, we're taking advantage of an opportunity that was provided for us. Like, sure, whatever. Like, you took that opportunity, and if you're open about it, that's one thing. But it's another thing to do all of that and then pretend like you are the oppressed group in the situation. Like, you are the struggling underclass that's being attacked for this. And then they'll turn around and be like, okay, well, us talking about this is attacking them for it. But this is just the objective reality of the situation. Like, you are a people that moved across the world and established your own tribe in someone else's area that they built themselves. And then you pretended like you are being attacked. You were given all the hospitality in the world. You've been given so much space to set up your own enclave. And then you want to pretend like we're the bad guys in the situation. Like, how arrogant do you have to be? And this is what I mean. Like we said
Well,
in the last time we talked about this,
I
is
think the only people more arrogant than the Jews are probably Indians, in my experience.
but that's what really gets to me on these kinds of discussions and talk, like these kind of changes that we see happening. It's like, no, you white people, you can't have any sort of claim to a to even your own enclave within the country your ancestors, but you can't even have that. That's too far. Something bad is going to happen if you people set up your own your own autonomous communities.
So I posted after that my message to the Sikh and Indian community of Canada: you will never be white. And
Yeah.
a guy retweeted me. He's like, racism is rife. But I'm thinking like, okay, I did say that. I knew that would get their goat. And I find that just hilarious. Yeah, they think that by coming and taking our stuff that they become us. But no, they're always destined, at least as long as they're surrounded by their own people, to live in India. An Indian can never not live in India. That's their curse, because India comes with them. They even think it's a cosmic injustice. Despite all their arrogance reeks of insecurity. I guess that's what I'm saying.
Yeah, I think that's part of it too. Because all this is undergirded with the idea that they are just somehow, and we've talked about this before, but somehow they are simultaneously true Canadians while also being true Sikhs or Punjabis or whatever you want to go with. Both of these things are true at the same time, as if you can just have this like multitude of identity just spilling in one into the next, and there's just no constraints on what like how am I the same as these people? And I don't mean this even in like a negative, like I'm better than you sense. I just mean this like
just distinction.
How are you having this distinct ethnic community, and then you're also Canadian, the same as me somehow? Like, how does that make any sense? So in what world does that actually logically make sense, just on the surface level looking at it?
It's just sheer envy. They had it with the Brits. Actually, they had it with the Muslims for a lot of their history. The Muslims in the country were extremely jealous of their wealth, and they're just such humanity, these people. It's just such a sea of humanity out there, and always has been.
Well, finish what you're gonna say.
No, I forget. It's good. No, they're a very envious kind of little people. I think it's because they're how they are. They can see it.
And so on that, talking about these different sort of ethnic groups within Canada, there's a quote in the in the article about a black resident of the area saying, "I have been here longer than these people, and I feel like an outsider now." And so this opens, and like I said, we're going to touch on this a bit. This opens up the discussion of having all these different ethnic groups and all these different peoples enclosed within the same sort of very broad idea of Canada. And that, like, how are you going to make this fit? Because it's not even just about white people versus non-white people, really.
Well, now it's about every race against every race.
I don't think we should be phrasing things in like this purely antagonistic way. But what you really have is you have like all these different competing ethnic groups that are vying for their own solidarity and enclaves against one another and trying to capture resources. Like, that's just really what is happening.
Yeah.
Because I see this in my day-to-day life. I've seen the sort of Arabic Muslim area of the city being, the shopkeepers all being the same, and the same people, the same Arabic people going to the same shops, and they speak in their own language, and you're like, that you're in that area. But then you see something like this. You'll see like a native guy come into the shop owned by an Arabic guy, and the Arabic guy will get really pissed because it might be a drunk native guy causing a little bit of trouble, and you'll see these people get really, really upset. You'll see the Arabic guy willing to actually kick the native guy out of the store, or at the very least just be pissed off by the mannerisms of the native guy. And this happens between all these different ethnic groups in their own areas. They'll actually have their ethnic conflicts playing out. And what are you going like? What are you going to do to solve this? Because it's one thing, like they'll hamstring white people all day on these things. They have no problem doing that. But how is the state going to solve all of these other issues as they start to broil
Well,
over?
we can see because we have a little vision of the future, and that's called New York, or Drew York. In fact, Bodega Gate just happened,
Right.
which was funny. That guy wandered in kind of oblivious, like, you call this a grocery store? Like there's a rat sitting on a pizza, etc. And of course, they are grimy little pieces of shit. But no one else will work. No one else wants to be there. Like no one else would run a business there. Simple as. And you wouldn't either. And then it turned on a dime, which I think some people actually predicted. They're like, I saw Antio predict this maybe, that within a week they're gonna hate bodegas again, the left, and it was true, because a bodega owner stabbed a guy who was trying to rob him. And so, yeah, so in New York, there are communities that are extremely well protected by the police, as we know, and we know which ones. And there are those who are more under kind of the Black Lives Matter kind of thoughts on law. And so they won't even be able to have bodegas there soon, if it keeps up like that. I assume actually it'll turn into more of a turf war, an anarcho tyranny thing, and there'll still be some sort of commerce, but it'll be more Mad Max than anything we're used to. Like, it already is. You can see it's just warring tiny ethnic neighborhoods.
Yeah, and I think that's one thing that the government just won't be willing to address, at least not for the foreseeable future, because
Well, their way of addressing it right now is to stop policing.
well, that's all they can really do, right?
Isn't it's the opposite
other
of
than
addressing
break
it,
down
really.
the whole notion of multiculturalism and say, okay, like you can we'll sanction ethnic enclaves. We'll just like full out say sanction this, and we'll be some intermediary. They'll be willing to be an intermediary between ethnic enclaves, and that would mean that they would have to allow whites into that mixture as well. And then you could just, hey, like we have this Arabic area of the city, and you have the Indian area of the city, and these are established like concrete things, and then you actually get the segregation. But no, instead they'll be like, well, no, we'll just have to let this multiculturalism play out. Let's attack anyone who's against this. And I'm like, for me, I'm not against ethnic enclaves, obviously, because I think white people should be able to have that.
I will disagree with Matt. Maybe I'm disagreeing with him. Maybe he's accounted for this, but I don't think that's a stable or long-term. It's not a long-term stable solution. That will result in tiny gang wars that will spread disorder at a rate quicker than the enclavism can maintain order.
Well, that's really I think the central question is, where does this all lead? Like, and how do you deal with it? Because I think at this point you can't just be like, have this some fantasy of mass deportation or whatever. Like that's not in the cards, and it's kind of a stupid thing to talk about.
No, you can have the fantasy. In fact,
Well,
I think you should. It's not going to happen.
What I'm saying is like it's a stupid thing to talk about, because then you just make yourself look like the villain that they claim you to be, when you don't even have any notion of what that would even actually look like.
Well, it's just it is just fantasy right now. Like there's no way. It's not
And
anywhere
like
on
saying
the
like
table.
I want this to happen, and I like there's so many things that are not even part of the picture here. Like I just don't think it's a very useful thing to discuss. And again, there's no point. What the reality, you have to face the reality as it is now. What the reality is,
Yeah.
you have certain groups that are actually producing ethnic enclaves. It is resulting in something like white flight, but it's also resulting in other ethnic groups that aren't part of that community saying like, whoa, this isn't what I signed up for either. This isn't my home now either. I'm being forced out as well. And what's going to happen? Well, the people that are left out are going to have to do something. They're going to have to find their own people, and then you're going to have a growth in these enclaves of different peoples. That's what's going to happen, and the government has to as far as we can tell, they're just going to ignore it and say, well, whatever. These minority groups face racism; they're allowed to do it. But once that starts causing problems because you didn't have any sort of mediation between these groups, that's when we're all going to face the consequences. It's not just white people are probably going to get hit hardest because we're not allowed to organize like that, but all these other groups are going to get hit hard too, because those ethnic resentments that have boiled over from their home countries into here, that stuff is going to come out of left field for especially these libtards that don't even have any notion of those interethnic conflicts from the across the sea, right? So what's going to happen when they have to deal with that? And that's what I'm.
In the Donbass, they were testing if someone was Russian or whatever by seeing how they pronounce one word, and it sounds the same to my ears. That's the level of actual fight we're now going to have. And no liberal who thinks, oh, it's all just one race, the human race, can even. You're not even in the same world anymore as the country you've now created. There was one more story out of that I thought was funny. It brought up the sick guy who he sued the amateur boxing of Canada because he thought he should be able to have a beard when he fights.
Right.
I mean, you've had to shave your mustache. I saw it. It was dismal. It's dismal when you had fights coming up. If you can put up with that, humiliating travesty, because that's been in the sport since, fighting Joe Johnson, 1928. I don't know when you have to shave to box rule came in, but it's been 100 years. Is that right? I don't know.
Honestly, when I asked them about why it's even a rule, because it's a pretty dumb rule, honestly, they didn't even know. They're like, it's just been around forever and no one's ever changed it. And I mean, on that particular story, well, that's one of those times where they're actually liberals are just actually upholding the value. When you say, well, religious freedoms, well, those religious freedoms come first. And I mean, they still uphold the religious values pretty decently. If you're Catholic, you don't actually have to work on Sundays. You can get out of working, right? And it's still pretty enforced pretty well. So I actually don't necessarily dislike that aspect. What I wish, though, is that sort of rule. They just got in that moment. They just got rid of it because it was just a rule, anyways.
But if we have, maybe that's a dumb example then. But if everyone gets their own rules, then there just are no rules. That's all that means. Well,
this is one of those things where, again, this notion of having a secular country is just a secular country where you have multiple cultures all mixing and living as they please. It just shows you how insane the possibility of that actually is. No one can actually have a set standard. You can't set a standard that fits across multiple faiths and multiple peoples, because the essential rules and essential laws governing these different peoples and these different faiths will inevitably conflict with a single standard of ruling and of law.
I go so far, and people have tried to talk me out of this, but I'll put it out. I'll put it out into the world and try and correct me if I'm wrong. Um, I would say that our ethnic makeup gives us proclivities towards seeing the world differently, sort of a Mencken thing. Even if a lion could speak, we couldn't understand him. I think that our ethnic differences are great enough that there's actually no way we can have the same sense of justice. So there would be there's no actual way except just strict going by it becomes arbitrary to enforce it across multiple groups because at least one of them will not be able to see it that way, or it'll go contrary to their notion of justice.
Well, I wouldn't agree with that because, I mean, like,
it's not a Christian view. I know that.
No, and you again, this is a whole other discussion, but something like that would imply that there isn't an absolute truth, that it is subjective in particular.
No, I don't think it does imply that.
Yeah, if your notion of justice would be based upon truth.
Well, sure, no, but listen, a bumblebee can see different, wavelengths of light. So everything that he looks at won't look the same as what we look at.
Yeah, but we're all like
that doesn't take away from the truth.
He's not human. The bumblebee's not human, though.
Right, but I'm saying that there's no such thing as a human in that sense, and I think Dugan agrees with this one. But
but I'm not a Duganist.
No, me neither. I mean,
just saying, Dugan is like an Orthodox Christian. Like, again, I don't think I would actually have to delve into that more, but it goes back to there is absolute truth, and there is notion of justice that is premised on that is written on every man's heart. Okay, so
I think man in that sense means white man.
What?
I think man in that sense means white man.
No, it's every man. The difference is in how the difference in particularities depends on, like, there's definitely biological differences, right? We can accept that.
But in phenomenology, isn't your cognitive view of the world entirely wrapped up in your physiology, like inseparably?
Well, that doesn't work exactly like that.
You know what? We're going to debate this properly. We'll debate it properly in 2 months' time.
Sure.
I'm gonna gather my men on this one. I'm gonna gather the white nationalists.
Yeah. Like just to quickly wrap it up, like, we talk about Adrian Arcand and his notion, right?
Yeah.
Of spirituality that is an international and universal.
Yes.
Fits along lines with the Catholic notion. So these concepts, these higher ideals like justice and truth, are that they're
but
true.
That's big J justice. That's big J justice, and I agree with that. Like, that's big J justice and big T truth. Our implementation and what we will view as fair and all that will be as different as our views of what God is. Like, the Arabs view, their view of God is different than ours. That's because they're viewing truth differently than us. They're seeing it from a different angle. They're seeing it through a different physiognomy.
I don't think that's how that works. Like, it doesn't entirely work that way. But again, we'll get into that. But again, we're just doing the Archon thing. Like, he does point out that there are particular differences based on ethnic differences, right? Changes in biology, but that doesn't mean like that truth is still truth, right? There's the universal is still universal. It's just what people are at that material level is different. But that doesn't change the fact that the absolute still applies in the same way. It just means what people are on the ground level and the material level are different.
What's the Blake quote? What's good for the ox is tyranny for the crow, or something of that sort. I think that. Well, we'll get into it. We got to debate this properly. It's actually, I find it a fascinating topic, and I think there's I think I'm in the minority, but I know there's others who agree with me, and I want to consult them, and I want to dig up the Blake quotes that would explain my metaphysics on it a little better.
Sure.
Okay, interesting. Yeah, we said we this was foreshadowed. We said we should have a proper debate on something soon.
We did say that, yeah.
All
We'll
right.
get into that.
Yeah.
Yeah, I guess how about we leave it at that and jump on to another topic?
Yeah, we read the absolute classic of Canadian nationalism, Lament for a Nation. So we'll be right back to talk about that.
Sounds good. Okay, so today we are going to dive into a discussion on Lament for a Nation by George Grant. And I guess kind of doing it in honor of Canada Day, though this episode might be released, I guess, a little while after that. And this is a phenomenal text for any Canadian nationalist who wants to have a solid grounding of understanding of what Canada's place is in the American Empire. And I think it's been discussed before, but I don't think we could have a show like this without touching on this text and maybe giving it a new perspective, because there's a lot, and this is the second time I've read it. There's a lot that I gleaned from this time around from some of the other discussions that we've had on the show of different texts that I've taken a new light now. And I guess just for people that don't know, George Grant is he was sort of a Canadian philosopher. He's probably the most prominent one. Certainly one of the guys that has some of the most interesting takes on Canada. And he also talks about technology and justice and all these other things. And he's pretty qualified guy. He was a professor. He taught in the Department of Religion, and had a pretty solid history in the academic sphere of Canada. But he goes overlooked. He's very, very overlooked in the mainstream. And a book like Lament for a Nation, you would think, after reading it, and I'm sure you probably agree with me, this would be the kind of book that would be required reading in the Canadian high schools. This would be huge. But of course it's not.
I actually wonder about that, because I remember I mentioned on the show before, I picked up a random book on nationalism out of my grandpa's shelf, and one of the first sentences was, "This is not a lament for a nation." It directly referenced Lament for a Nation.
Uh-huh.
I'm wondering if it must have some cachet, some cultural cachet. And I think that might have diminished in the last 40 years. But I think at one point it was probably quite a bit more talked about, is my guess. But I don't know.
Yeah, well, that's the thing, is I don't really know now.
We should have Tyler popularized it. We should have asked him how he came across it.
Yeah, that would be good. Now, I would assume he came across it from his religious background, and being in theology in a Christian school, in a Canadian Christian school.
But did he pick it up randomly off a library shelf, or did a professor recommend it?
Well, I mean, I would imagine they would be more in touch, because this guy being a professor teaching in the religious department and being a Christian, that might, and being Canadian nationalist, Canadian Christian University might actually promote works from a professor with a Christian background. So that might make sense.
Yeah.
I just know I brought this book up to my dad, and he never heard of it, and he's pretty relatively in touch with this kind of book. So that's where I might think maybe it didn't really have. I mean, didn't have as much of a trickle down to the average person looking for these kinds of things. But yeah, I'm not too sure.
It's certainly one way or the other become, just like the first book you read, becoming a Canadian nationalist in the last few years. And I think it deserves it, because it puts to bed a lot of the like Americanized versions of nationalism that a lot of people tend to pick up. it really is. It's not libertarian in the least. It's not capitalist in the least.
Yeah, he pretty strongly rejects any notion of Americanism as integral to Canadian identity. And the thrust of the text, for those who haven't read it, and again, if you haven't read it, you should read it. And we had our book club, our reading group going with the show. So again, jump in there and follow along. But one of the main things here is that he rejects this notion that Canada has the same values as America, right? And a lot of people will compare Canada and America, especially now, or hold themselves as Canadians in opposition to Americans. But his notion of what that actually means is much different than how we see it play out in modern day discourse.
Yeah, he's saying we're more conservative.
Yeah, and that's basically the core of what his understanding of Canadian identity is this group of people that had to live in a more harsh environment, that had to overcome a more savage wilderness, you could say, that had more of a loyalty to their the British past, this loyalist kind of sentiment and this sort of British sense of nationalism tied to the crown. And with all of that came a stronger sense of order and restraint, and in fact, a willingness to suppress the individual's liberty in favor of the common good, right? And this notion of the common good comes out in his work very, very often. And I think that would be the main takeaway, that Grant gives us in understanding Canadian identity, is this notion of subordinating your personal freedom for the common good, willing to be a disciplined member of a nation so that the nation can thrive better. And this is what he was saying was developing in Canada over its first centuries, right through the beginning of Confederation with John A. Macdonald and everything. And it just got set aside with the liberalizing, homogenizing process that the American Empire implemented upon Canada. So that is the thrust of the sentiment that he's bringing us with Lament for a Nation.
Mm-hmm. Sorry, I overloaded again. I'm going to say my hot take before it gets away from me here.
Okay.
I found it quite boring on a second read, but not because that's not a reflection on the book at all. It's simply that it's been bandied about in our circle so much and for long enough now that I felt like I've been reading it every day for the last 4 years, and to read it again, I just was like, I was the opposite of you. I was not pulling a lot new out of it. I was just like, I don't know. It's just old hat to me by now, I guess. But that's true of quite a few Star Trek episodes too. Like it's just I've watched it too much. Like it's not a reflection on the book. I don't mean to say.
Yeah. But what did you pull out this time? What's the hot take?
Well, my favorite part this time that I hadn't noticed before was that he actually has a very light touch of humor that no one talks about. Mm. There's this wry little bit of humor, or like this sort of exasperated, an exasperated humor it's subtle, but I think it's in there, especially when he's talking about the Liberals in chapter 4 or 5 there, and all the ways that the Liberals, he takes kind of shot after shot about how the actual entire purpose of the Liberal Party is to dismantle Canada, and that's like their explicit purpose. Mm-hmm. And I don't know, maybe I'm a little insane, but I could picture sort of a jaded old grandpa, which maybe he was at the time, kind of, had a little, almost a wink in there. It seemed funny to me anyway. Maybe just because it's such a brutal reaming out of the liberals, which is funny, but I don't know.
Well, I mean, even I think his wife writes in the afterword. People mistook a lot of what he was saying as like just her words were implacable pessimism and obscurity. But yeah, I think what was really going on there is a little bit of that jaded humor.
Yeah, when he's
Um,
talking about a lament, and he's like, I don't mean a lament like is dead or whatever. I mean, whatever. He's there's like maybe a touch of melodrama in there for not comedic effect, but it's like how Rex Murphy will sometimes write.
mhm. Well, on the note, like one of the main points that he touches on with the liberals is um, he talks about the liberals as giving you the giving you the option or selling themselves as the guys that will steer the ship, so to say, in this age of progress. That things are changing. Canada is going to fall apart. It's not going to have this national identity anymore. But we can take hold and make that process smoother. We can fold ourselves into the American empire. Make sure we don't crash land this. And uh, you know, ultimately, what he talks about is Canada kind of just ended up getting turned into a what do you call the branch plant of the American empire, where
Hmm.
we're kind of used as manufacturing. Um, the industrial basis is just there to um, export our materials to an empire.
It's such an apt metaphor. It's barely like a metaphor.
Yeah, yeah, but it's like it just ends up being so on the nose. Um, and the I guess the funny thing in that is he the way he explains it is the liberals selling themselves is making this process smooth. Don't worry, we have your interests in mind because we're going to make sure we don't crash the ship in this process. But as he goes on discussing this nature of cosmopolitanism and desire for profit in this capitalist empire, um, he kind of reveals that the underlying intentions there aren't really the smooth sailing of the ship, but more so the justifying their own acquisition of wealth and their own comfort, embedding themselves in, as cosmopolitan global citizens. And the notion of the global citizen, nowadays it gets applied to everyone. They even teach it in schools, like, oh, we're all just global citizens. We have a responsibility to everyone else in the world. But what that really, they don't really only applies to those elites that have their interests in, um, you know, open markets, globalized free trade, because they're really the only ones that benefit from being that. If they can be that cosmopolitan in Toronto, they can set themselves up in the same standard, the same echelons of the elites as the people in New York or in London. And that makes their lives much more comfortable, and that makes them much more amenable to profit. So when they talk about being the best option for the transition into this neoliberal age, they pretend, and this is kind of, I guess that underlying dig that he has in there. They're pretending that they're sailing the ship smoothly, but in reality, it's simply to enrich themselves, and they don't care that they have ultimately destroyed the underlying Canadian identity, that they've sold their people out as branch plant workers for this empire that does not care about anything other than homogenization and universalization of the entire world for the most efficient process to maximize profit. And this is where he starts to bring in these technological arguments and analyses of, in the age of progress and in technological advancement, you're always going to have this push towards more efficiency. And I think this is something that he's drawing on from
Well,
Alol, right?
towards profit, I think is how he
Right.
puts it, right? Drive for profit, higher profit. So
Yeah, like maximizing efficiency and standardization for more profit. And yeah, I think this is something that he draws on from Jacques Ellul, right? I think Ellul refers to it as technique, but it's like the idea of, well, at one point in time, you might have different railroad standards for Germany and for France, but that's inefficient if you're crossing borders with a cargo load. So now you have to have the same set of railroad tracks for every single country in the world, so that you can, maximize the efficiency of globalized free trade.
Okay, I have 2 points to that specifically. One color, one commentary. The color commentary, Germans are called squareheads, or used to be. It was a good, not even a slur, but just a nickname for them.
Yeah.
It's because they were the first ones to standardize ship carpentry. And their bolts, or their wooden nails, I guess at the time they'd be. They standardized them to a square head of the same dimension. So they're square heads. So you say it's funny you picked the German example. They are the literal inventors of that kind of thing, and notorious across the world for it still today in the engineering world and stuff like that. The commentary part, I said we should read Buckminster Fuller next, and I want to read Grunch of Giants. And his first thing in the book is he was making a standardized home. Like, he was an engineer too. He was trying to make a standardized home, and his first thing is this tirade against how you couldn't make these fab kind of IKEA homes that he wanted to build that could be erected so quickly and sold so cheaply because of all the different plumbing code and all this across everywhere. So his entire critique in Grunch of Giants almost amounts to this exact criticism of the inefficiencies of locality.
Right. And so that needs to be overcome. And basically, when Grant talks about the liberal drive to homogenize everything, this is both a technological one, where all the standards around the world have to be universalized, but at the same time, it's also, I guess you could say, a social one, where all the peoples around the world are going to be standardized. You've got to make these sort of drone automatons that we always talk about in the liberal system, so that they can more efficiently be slotted into their roles as consumers in the American empire's neoliberal system, right? And he talks about Canadians being forced into this, and this is partly due to the proximity to the empire. And so what you get is they view any sense of nationalism as as being in the way of this process.
I think language is just one of the most obvious ways to look at this, and because it's the easiest way. So I guess this might be a criticism. We say that they're doing this, but how many people are just learning English and standardizing to that of their own volition? How much does it become a self-propelling process?
Well, that's kind of when he's describing this, and when he talks about the inevitability of progress, like, that's kind of what he's touching on. Now, he doesn't really, I think later in the text, he doesn't say that, like, progress is inevitable.
Right. Oh, and he has a whole other book about this called Technology and something, right?
Yeah. Okay. I believe so. But again, the issue on that regard is that you can't just, like, resist it when the world is, when the developments in technology require it, right? Like, it's not like these people are willingly deciding to learn English out of their own volition. It is, you either learn that or you get left behind. In the same way, you either adopt the new technological advancement or you get left behind, right? Well, and that was sort of the issue in the Canadian context with Diefenbaker's approach of trying to resist the change without properly developing an understanding on how to adapt to the changes of the world, the progress the American empire presenting them. But one example, and I think I talked about this in the live stream, was Grant talks about Diefenbaker's unwillingness to use his civil servants. To make sure that he had proper control of what was going on in Canada, right?
Yes.
And in a in a world where now states require managerial states for proper functioning. You need a strong manager class to make sure all these things happen. If you are in that sort of sovereign position, you just don't even utilize that technological advancement, so you could say a social technological advancement to get your aims, then you just get left behind.
Yeah, or shot to death, like the French
right.
going into World War I in red pants.
So that's one of these things here that he talks about is, yeah, you're basically forced to deal with technological advancement. And he has a whole section at the end of the book where he talks about, well, can these ancient traditions like the Catholic Church, internalize this and deal with it, or is this going to destroy all these institutions and traditions because it just it's too much for people to handle. And I want to touch on that a little bit later. But ultimately, you're forced to confront the advancements as they are, and if you don't, then you screw yourself over, like Diefenbaker. And this kind of this is what we've talked about this before on the show, and this is again one of these things that I'm pulling out. That obviously I didn't have the tools to view this text with the first time around. Is now that we have this understanding of states and power, and how systems change over time, that we got from like Joel and Marcus's article from Firstness. Now we can kind of see what's going on here. There's kind of like a behind the scenes of what Grant is talking about, right? So you have the whole notion of, well, when one state advances a new type of system to secure their power, right? To a new structure.
Sure.
That's more efficient, more effective.
Mass manufactured weapons for the Second World
War,
or whatever.
So then everyone else is forced to adopt that too, or they get subsumed. And this is what we see. This is what basically Grant is kind of touching on there, without really, because that's something coming from Juvenal and I think Scotch Bull.
Yes. Quick side note or side thing. Yeah. Another Juvenalian point he makes is how Diefenbaker alienated the academic community.
Right.
I don't think I have more of a point to that, except that it reminds me of Trump. But
yeah,
it's another good Juvenalian example anyway.
I think that's a good point too, in that in this whole discussion of Diefenbaker's failure to secure Canadian nationalism is, I don't know if you could criticize on that, like to the extent where you're like, well, maybe he should have done his reading on how these things operate and figure this all out, right? Like that, you might not be able to criticize him on that level, but you can at the very least say he fell into common pitfalls that nationalists often seem to do when they're approaching these subjects, because they just simply you might say call it too reactionary, right? Like, alienating the intelligentsia because you want to purely have this populist appeal to the rural class leads you to not actually being able to support the rural class, because you do need some academia on your side to formulate new structures. Because maybe if he had those people on his side, he could have had someone advising him on how to deal with the dynamism of the new structure.
I think you might have overthought that one. I think it's just literally that the academia was a powerful faction at the time that he failed to secure. Like I don't know if they would have been useful to him. It's irrelevant. They managed to sabotage him enough by ridiculing him in the newspapers and at their dinner parties among the elite that it sabotaged him enough. And wasn't that the point maybe I skimmed that part. Maybe I'm wrong, but that was my impression.
Right. Well, whatever it is, he failed to recognize these structural changes and I guess leverage any of these notions of the advancement in states in a way that he could actually secure Canadian nationalism against the spread of the American empire.
Could you elaborate on his the third failure? And big one was to do with Quebec. I'm drawing a blank. I might have rushed over that bit, but there's a whole chapter on how Quebec was skip it.
Yeah, let's leave that.
Oh man, I said I didn't get anything new out of it, and then I completely actually blank on a section of the book. I guess I should have read it more carefully again anyway. But whatever. Moving along. What's so those are some of Diefenbaker's failures, and now you can see them. You were saying from a new perspective.
Yeah. Well, because if we draw on Marcus's article, right, that political metastability article, Marcus talks about the natural dynamism of states, right? The metastability is the whole is like the instability causing the stability.
Yes.
And Grant constantly touches on the dynamism of this era, right? Especially the states in the 20th century, constantly shifting and adapting to the advancements in technology, right? And in Marcus's article, he talks about how the internal structures, the internal institutions have to find some balance between conserving certain aspects so that you don't, just spaghetti doesn't all fall out of your pockets, but at the same time keeping up with changes so that your state doesn't get left behind. And there's this interplay going on here. So that's something Grant seems to be touching on. And again, Canada really lacking the ability to maintain any of that, and then just getting subsumed by the American empire, because the attempt to be too conservative and sit back on your heels and sort of just hold on to this old notion of Canada without integrating the dynamic progresses in technology, in statecraft, all these things, obviously leads you to just being overtaken by a stronger, a more powerful force.
So what a pickle. Force. He says Canada is conservatism, pretty much. But then, so to adapt to the new times, we have to, abandon that. So we're abandoning ourselves. But
that's not even really what he's saying.
Well, but isn't it just how could he have solved it? How can you?
Well, I mean, again, I think going back into this, the important notion is because what he says is the impossibility of conservatism in our era is the impossibility of Canada. Right? As Canadians,
that's the line I was thinking of. Yeah.
A ridiculous task in trying to build a conservative nation in the age of progress.
Yes.
On a continent we share with the most dynamic nation on earth.
Yes.
So the current of modern history is against us. Now, his point is that purely conservative notion that Canada started with is unsustainable, especially in the age of progress. That's not that it's a bad thing. Like, I think, and I'm sure many of us will be able to agree, that tradition and can be conserved. But we'll draw back onto Owen's article, for example, right? There's a difference between the conservatism that tries to maintain traditions as a sort of artifact. You just sort of crystallize them in a museum, so to say, and hold them up like that, as opposed to an understanding of a living tradition that you participate in without cutting yourself off from that tradition. So, for example, that the notion that Grant brought us with Canada being this country of willing to subsume individual freedoms to constrain them for the common good, I wouldn't say that's impossible in our current age. I think you can actually utilize technology to bring forth that common good, and you can utilize states to ensure the common good, right?
Yeah. I mean, I guess the CBC that he was that's mass media, which was a new technology, which was being used to give a common culture, conservative culture.
Mm-hmm.
It's
so that's where we kind of can read between the lines or pull in different ideas and notions here after the fact, later on, now that we've kind of seen it played out, now that we have these other tools at our disposal. So it's again bringing in that Marcus article about metastability. Well, you have the dynamic reality of states and the way things shift and change into more advanced organizational institutions to secure your own state. But it's again that metastability requires you to conserve certain aspects. But if you just withhold any development, then what happens to Canada happens, and you get subsumed by a stronger state. So the impossibility of conservatism is this notion of conservatism where you just sit on your heels and try to be the same state, the same the museumified version of tradition. And I think that's where his critique of this aspect of conservatism is. And the funny thing is, just to finish off this point here, is that even John A. Macdonald recognizes this. I have a biography. I haven't read the whole thing of John A. Macdonald, but he actually does say that conservatism in itself is no way to, I'm paraphrasing here, but is no way to establish your nation, right? Like you can't run on conservatism. You have to understand the progress of the age and deal with those factors too, right? So even from Canada's beginning in that regard, we had an understanding that we can't be pure conservatives in this sort of impotent sense.
Yeah. So this is what do the conservatives or traditionalists, I should say, who don't want to feel too bound to harmful traditions and want to move with the times usually wind up calling themselves perennialists. Is that wrong?
Yeah, I guess you could say there's a perennialist notion to that. Yeah.
So then in order to conserve something without being bound by it, at least in its rigidity, then is that possible? How do you reinterpret things which doesn't, in a way that doesn't destroy them? Okay,
so here's where I think some of the ideas popped into my head about seeing new things come out of this text, right? So Grant talks about technology as being an entirely a centralizing thing, right? More and more power gets centralized as technology advances, and things get more universalized, more homogenized, because this technological advancement demands it. Now, this I think was his blind spot that we can, now that we've taken on, for example, Matt Parrott and what the things that he's saying.
You're going to say devolutionary technology?
There we go.
So
in that sense, what we've been talking about on this show about creating your own communities and environments and media using the devolutionary technology like this podcast itself.
In fairness to Grant, nobody in our age knows about devolutionary technology either yet, except Matt Parrott. This brand new thinking, the Web 3.0 guys and Matt Parrott are that's it. This is a 5-year-old idea.
So this is where I think we're starting to get something here. We're getting ahead of the curve and we're getting a solution, because in Grant's notion, it's pretty hard to maintain tradition if you are forced to be subsumed within centralized technology that requires the homogenization of everything.
Yes.
You can't have any individual peoples in this notion. But now that we have technological advancements that actually work in our favor, that we can leverage, that brings back the notion that we can have a living tradition that we define ourselves outside of this homogenized network.
Do you know how how a computer program talks to another computer program?
No idea.
All right, it's called an API, right? Which is a bunch of code. You write it's the handles. They can be called handles sometimes, I think. And so your code can be your code, but you've got an API, this outer shell that another program or another programmer can grab onto and access different parts of your data or whatever. That's to some extent, that's part of what almost
Yeah.
every evolutionary technology uses right now too. That comes from it's mostly a thing that came about from the internet. I mean, it became much more prominent then. Before that, more programs were more self-contained.
Right.
So, I mean, just from an engineering sense, then the solution is you have your program and your code, your binary, and then you have an API. Now, this is more akin then to something like the early nation states, where you'd have a country with its customs and localities, and it would be a self-contained thing, but then you'd have diplomats, merchants, that reach out and conduct trade, etc. So I guess the only way, since to be completely self-isolated would mean just to kind of not exist. Like if someone was completely isolated in the network, then they couldn't hear us right now and we wouldn't be able to hear them. So they don't even really exist for all intents and purposes, so they don't matter. So perhaps the solution to everything is not to try and withdraw into an enclave so much, but to define first the boundaries of that enclave through outreach by establishing proper diplomatic trade channels first. Then you can define the interior position that can be the kernel, like that can be yours.
That's an interesting approach. Yeah.
It's counterintuitive. But it's only because you have a proper and well-defined API that you can have self-contained code.
Right. Interesting.
There, I solved it. No, I don't know. So I think, but on a practical sense, that would mean that we need to establish, and this would, I guess, tie to Josh's article. This would be establishing modes of etiquette and formal, like, how, like, if a diplomat visiting another king's court or whatever, there'd be all sorts of rules that would be followed internationally. Like, I think one of the main ones was you didn't kill him, or is considered very rude, or like an act of war, right? And
yeah, probably not a good idea.
Yeah, or even just old laws of hospitality, you feed a guest or this sort of thing.
Right.
So, and that's what allowed these nations to, maybe you couldn't send an army in, but you could definitely send a diplomat in, and he'd be protected. Yeah, so that ties to Josh's thing. That's the
leveraging the hyper world.
Yeah.
So I think bringing in those kinds of that kind of thinking, understanding that technological progress is sort of out of our hands in how it develops, but not necessarily restricting us to finding our own solutions. And even in the broader scheme of things, I don't necessarily think that, for example, the Canadian tendency to have more, I guess, order, being this order society and having the individual freedoms restricted in favor of the common good. I don't think technology necessarily precludes that from being an established value and a way of operating, regardless of what kind of technology you have. I think those values can be eternal. Like those traditions are still going to be there. You can still conserve those and live through them. You just have to leverage the technology that you have in front of you to ensure that they still get maintained. And that's the main problem that we're facing now, is that we never bothered to do that. And now we have so many Canadians that latch on to American notions of individual freedom that never have really been part of our history. But that's all we're given, that it's imported culturally to us. And so to be a sort of like a dissident, but I use this in the broadest sense, and like, an anti-vaxxer type or a trucker protester, to resist anything means that you always have to define it your opposition to anything in Canada or anything in the Canadian government as a sort of pushing back against someone infringing on your personal freedom. And this is the issue that we're dealing with, because if we had taken the Canadian approach on those subjects, on a mass scale, we would be saying, instead of you are infringing on my personal freedoms, my body, my choice, you would be making the argument from the notion of the common good, where you could say, let's use the vaccine example. Like, the way that you, the government, are implementing these vaccine policies is actually not in the interest of the common good, because you are not preventing the spread. You are not effectively protecting your population with these policies. And in fact, you're harming people by the social restrictions you're putting on the populace. And therefore, that is an illegitimate way to apply your policies. And that is you could probably boil that down into a more effective argument or more effective propaganda. But starting with that premise would be the Canadian notion. Instead, we picked up this American, negative freedom.
Yes. In that sense, the criticism that these drugs weren't tested enough before you release them on the public, the vaccine wasn't tested enough, is a valid criticism, because it pertains to the common good. Whereas the argument that you shouldn't give vaccines because what you said, the my body, my choice argument, not a good argument.
So I like what I'm so at the end of the day, we can still reclaim that tradition, I think. And I think the average the Canadian, there's still that Canadian personality type or those attributes. He talks about the sort of stodgy, rigid, like composed. I think I forget the exact phrase that he uses for it, but I think he's stodgy's in the mix there. But like this notion of this ordered and stodgy Canadian type, that's still here. And also at the same time, the sort of rugged man, the willing to overcome the savageness of our environment. Like these are still things playing under the surface. It's just we need to open up the space for those values to be maintained, so that we don't completely lose it in this homogenization.
So I was just about to ask a question. I thought of my own example. How would you maintain our kind of Canadian value of outsideness? But then, of course, it's clearly by not destroying our forests and parks and whatever.
Right. And I think I don't want to overuse this whole devolutionary technology point, because again, we're starting to touch on something in a way that might be useful, but it's not fully developed. So I don't know if that's
let's fly by the seat of our pants. Go wild. Go
shoot a dead horse there. But we have the ability to give Canadians permission, at least whatever Canadians listen to this podcast in this sense, to embrace their identities in this way, right? Yeah. But I think if you open up more of these decentralized notions of technology and have your own spaces and develop your boundaries, and like you were talking about, the way you interface with other groups, if you let people slot into that and allow for that behavior to define, Canadianness, I guess you could say, or it might be more local because of the decentralized context of this. That's, I think, how it gets preserved, or that's how it gets lived in a way that continues the tradition in the way that is necessary.
Well, how do you mean?
Well, what do you mean?
Letting people slot in.
Well, like for example, if you have, let's say, so you have our podcast, for example, right?
Yep.
And you have us saying it's okay to act a certain way, or it's like what we use at the beginning of the episode where you're talking to your average buddies.
Oh, yeah.
Saying you're giving them permission to act a certain way, right?
Sure.
it's that kind of like developing that cultural space for them to slide in there and be like, hey, this is where I'm able to be this way. And
Okay, so we're
you kind of defy the hegemony of the modern media, the mainstream media, saying that no, you have to be this drone consumer that has no purpose, and instead saying, hey, you guys, you're one of us.
sure.
Like be that wild bird of boy, or
Like
be that stodgy
how a
old style
punk show
Canadian.
gave punks a place where they could go have a bone through their
Right,
nose or
right.
whatever. Okay, and then defined it, and then the people, and then it's a cyclical that way. Like it's
Yeah,
self generating.
and then that's when we get back to that notion of what we get from Owen of the sort of the living tradition of guys actually being able to not just look back on some preserved identity, but create it apart from this homogenized liberal empire,
Is
right?
conservatism the true counterculture, Mr. Watson?
I don't think that's the case here.
No. Okay, but that's what you're getting at, though, is that we're making a true subculture that's lived in.
I think that's that's what the aim of this use of devolutionary technology is pointing towards. Yeah.
Okay. I totally agree. I think we're already in it. Like I think that
Yeah.
like we're like the garage band playing the rock songs, like we're making our own tunes here, but we're going into a well-established thing that no one likes to name, mostly because it got whatever, because of all the schisms. But okay. Well, so is this something to build a nation out of?
Well, you're gonna have to maybe elaborate on that more.
I understand that our little subculture could be the seed of a nation.
Uh-huh.
First of all, the state of the subculture now, would you say that's A, good, and B, probable?
Well, I would say this might be a good place. This will be a good spot to fill in our, I guess, our text that we're reading is something, get a better understanding of what nation is. Talk about some of these texts. I know guys like Keith Woods and Joel Davis have been sort of outlining that pretty well, but it'd be good for us to get our own first person understanding of that. But I would say part of that process of becoming a nation is being able to define yourselves and understand who you are. You agree upon that.
Yeah.
In one aspect is that. Another aspect is obviously having your ethnic connections. Like you are a broad family. You have that sort of biological connection involved in being a nation, on top of also recognizing you're in the same community. That's why, like, I'm not going to pretend just because I'm white, I'm also part of like Germany or something.
Right.
I can just have an instant connection to Germans. Like, no, my nation has to be defined by the people that I am closely connected to here.
Yeah.
Now, what's been denied to Canadians, or at least to European Canadians, like the real founding stock Canadians,
To real Canadians.
is the notion of being a real nation, not the civic, like, economic zone that's been just utilized as part of this trade empire.
Dogbot always calls America like a continent-wide strip mall. We'd be like we'd be a continent-wide potash mine.
Yeah, or like just a branch plant. Like no, you're just branch plant people, and we import. Now we're at the point. This is Grant never saw this happen, but we're at the point where we just import people from all over the world to work the branch plant of the American empire. Like that's not a real identity. So I think that's the key here, is that we can start to lay out the groundwork of what we really are. What this nation can be
since
as an actual nation, not just this
yeah,
branch plant.
but since so much of the Laurentian elite and our own academics and our own founding stock have completely abandoned us and don't seem to be coming to the light anytime soon, is there any value in just saying, okay, you know what? Sorry, we got to get rid of John A. MacDonald even, and we got to get rid of our. This is kind of a devil's advocate point. I don't.
Sure.
But what if we just dispel with all notions Canadian to better expedite our creation of a new nation? And then we can that would like let us disassociate.
But we already did that. They already did that. Right. I think that's part of the chapter 7 is his last chapter is like, hey, now that what is it? Basically along the lines of well, we're out of the backwoods of Canada and into this exciting and American empire. Mm-hmm. This is sort of like the liberal notion, right? These cosmopolitan elites have pushed us. That's what they pushed already. They already said we're no longer this backwoods nation. We're part of this American empire. Let's drop it all and be that now.
Or more modernly, we're a post-national state.
Now it's post-national state. So I don't know. They already.
So do we get Canada? Can we just take Canada for us? Because they abandoned it.
Because that's part of the thing too, and I think that's I would call it a white pill, is that because these people have just dropped it and have this pretense of being good liberals, good neoliberals as a part of the American empire, our ruling class, and they don't really. Who knows what degree of knowledge they have about the potentiality for this decentralized or devolutionary, ethnic communities coming forward here.
I doubt very much.
And Canadian people, probably not, right? That's our history to claim and to bring forth and to carry into the future and live it out.
Oh yeah, everything belongs to us. I forgot, everything belongs to us. Of course,
because they
abandoned it. We didn't abandon
exactly.
Yeah.
They're not even. They don't think they're a part of it anymore.
But would it help to change the name?
That's us.
Just for pure marketing purposes, would it help to change the name? We could maybe go with something a little more Anglo instead of like native based this time. Can we be like the Prairie Boys? I don't know. Can we be that's a shitty. We've got like this. No one's. Would it help to change the name?
Why would you change the name though?
Well, just to not be associated with because the elites still have the name. Like Trudeau is like still calling himself Canadian and all, despite all. How do we separate our brand here?
Well, I think there's two things to consider. Maybe there's two things to consider. The name would have to kind of come out of the process itself. You wouldn't just slap it on in advance if there was a new name. And then B, I think...
Wouldn't it be funny, though? Like, it's always like, okay, like just a name, like something like the Prairie Boys. Like, not that, but something like 100 years later, the Prairie Boys. Shit, it's stuck. Son of a bitch.
So, yeah, someone pulls the fucking archives from the show. Like, we're looking for a name. What do we got? And they just Prairie Boys is good enough.
Yeah, good enough. Yeah, fuck it. It's Friday.
Anyways. Well, and I think the second thing to consider too is that that notion of a Canadian has been a part of what our ancestors have participated in too, right? Like,
right.
If I don't know, I feel like there's a connection to the guys that fought in the War of 1812 and fought in World War I and World War II as Canadians, regardless of what you think about those situations.
No, we've been over this in depth,
based on them being Canadian, right?
Yeah,
and I mean, like World War I specifically, they were known to be like wild, like aggressive and ruthless warriors, and I wouldn't necessarily want to drop that because there's connotations in being connected to that too. So
Plus, I'm proud of those guys and
those
all
are the
that.
things I would consider in the name convention.
Yeah. Yeah. So how do we separate? It'd be good if maybe they'll just drop the name entirely.
They might just
They might drop
they might
any
just
pretenses of even branding at Canada or anything. Like, it's not out of the realm of possibility.
well, it's like what they do. I don't know. The Edmonton Eskimos. I think they dropped Eskimos in favor of Elks, and like actual Eskimo, actual Inuit people were like, "Well, what the fuck? We like that name. Like that was a good name. Like you guys were repping us. What the hell?"
Yeah.
But they're willing to drop those symbols just because they'll pay lip service to the notion of progress and being better. So who knows where
Yeah,
that
they'll
goes.
get rid of Canada because of its racist past or whatever, and they'll just rename it they'll rename it Prairie Land or something like generic and marketable.
They'll literally call themselves Leafland or something.
Yeah. Oh man. Yeah. District 9 or whatever. Yeah.
There was one interesting thing I wanted to, because I don't know how much else there is to talk, but there was in this last chapter he kind of dispenses with the I don't know if you call it like Whig history or liberal notions of history. He also refers to like Hegel's like notion of like progress is sort of being determined.
Yeah, some of that went over my head, I'm not gonna lie.
But basically what he's getting at here is the difference between necessity. I want to make sure I get this right here. So it's basically the assumption that as things progress in history, they necessarily become more developed and better and freer than it has in the past. It's obviously sort of a liberal notion. And well, even what he says, some of the Western theologians of the 10th century started saying like this is like a divine providence and it was necessary and essential.
Mm-hmm.
And what he's saying here is he disagrees with this notion, right? He disagrees that history necessarily progresses into something more good.
I mean, it's just, yeah, I think you'd have to be bananas to think that theory is correct.
But that's what we are left under the assumptions of with the liberal power structure is
Yes.
that you inevitably things are better.
No, you're right. This is a central tenet of liberalism is that things are progressing ever onwards and better. We were just savage or whatever. It's been let's not retread this old ground. It's an old point, but yeah, no. You know what? Again, it's one of these things. I'm saying it feels like Grant's making a tired point to me, but it originally came from Grant, went around the circle, then got to me. Like, I'm sure he was of the utmost influence in being one of the first to make that point in our circle, at least. But
like again, it's pretty crazy to realize. Well, this is written in the '60s, and a lot of it you could imagine in the '60s. A lot of it was tough. Would have been difficult to conceive of. Like some people, well, I even said this in the discussion group on the text. Like there's one line where he said there was a note like when you call the American Empire in that time, people were what are you talking about?
Mm-hmm.
That's on the age of empires is done, and so he's seen things way in advance here.
Yes.
And it's very prescient, and so much of it did come true. And yeah, at the end of the day, one of the key things to reject is the notion that necessity and good are identified with each other, right? So what his point there is
that was a tricky one for me too.
Yeah. So what he's saying there is that just because something is necessary doesn't mean it's good.
Oh, yes.
So, yes, technological advancement was necessary. Like you couldn't avoid this. but that doesn't mean it was good that it happened. And he applies this on Canada as a whole.
I guess
It might have been necessary for Canada as it stood in that day to be dissolved, Canadian nationalism to fall apart. That doesn't mean it was good. But the problem is the liberal understanding is that things that are necessary are good. And he critiques this by the notion of, for example, the hundreds of innocents, thousands, millions of innocent lives over history, their death might have been necessary, and it might have ended up advancing history because that is just the way things ended up. It just was that way. The way she goes. That doesn't mean that any of that was good, and that doesn't mean that we should be making decisions based on necessity. We should have an aim towards the good at the end of the day.
No, absolutely.
And so reconciling all this comes into play when we look ahead at where we're going.
The subtle part of that point is he's not saying he says that's not explicitly a liberal point. That's just implicitly a liberal point.
Right.
I think I'm increasingly thinking expediency is the source of most evil.
Yeah, and that could be a fair point. A lot of, and again, we already had that discussion too on resistance to evil by force, about how evil comes about, and that I think if we could tie that in as well, we could say that the willingness to either profit or make an advancement more quickly will result in an evil decision being made as opposed to good. And that is sort of what the cosmopolitan elites did to us in this advancement. He says separate the notion of necessity away from the good. And so you could have had, potentially, it could have been inevitable that Canada dissolved in the way that it did. But that doesn't mean that it had to be done in a sort of evil way that left us completely dispossessed and restricted us of our identity.
Right.
But when you tie those things together, then you don't put what is good and what is not good into the equation. When you just say necessity is good, then how do you then you can justify any action that you make?
All right, it's like this.
Yeah.
The mafia comes up to this dad, and the dad's liberalism, and they say, "Okay, we're gonna kill your kid." The dad says, "Oh shit! Well, you got like 50 of you guys. I don't got a chance. So I guess you know what? Pay me $100 and I'll do it. It's gonna happen anyway. I might also have some good come out of it." And we're like, "Is that a terrible metaphor?" But like the liberals, in seeing that Canada was failing from the American encroachment, then we're like, "Yeah, I guess we'll be fine. We'll be the ones to lead that, and we'll call it good." Did I miss the point?
I think that's a decent example, because I mean that is actually the example you used earlier. Is the Liberals justifying the taking the helm of the ship of Canada and saying that, well, we'll guide this more carefully for you because it has to change.
Yeah.
But we'll be the ones to do it so we can at least profit off of it.
Right. Okay. Yeah. Okay. So my example was perhaps a bit ugly because it was on the nose. It wasn't my usual elegant metaphors. It's because I went with a mafia example and not maybe something either factory or forest based. This is my usual want. I've learned my lesson. I apologize.
Yeah, like at the end of the day, the key there is, again, not identifying that necessity with good.
I got it. Okay, so the beaver sees me coming up with a backhoe to knock down his dam. And the beaver's like, screw it, I'll drive the backhoe. I'm like, thanks, I'm going to go take a smoke break. Yeah, that's better. That's more on brand. Okay, I'm back.
Got it. We're back.
All right. I think
at the end of the day, just because Canada was in a position to lose the nationalism as it stood there, Just because it seemed to be a necessity doesn't mean that it was a good thing that it happened. And that is why, like, in this lament for the nation, I don't think we should be like taking a black-pilled sort of, oh, well, it's dead. We see this on the internet all the time from Canadians, right? I think you were calling someone out over this stuff of like, oh, the Canadian blah blah blah. Like I don't even know what they say. It just pisses me off all the time when I read that kind of thing. But just because we lost that based on those particular standards, doesn't mean that it was good that it happened.
Oh yeah,
and it does mean that we can still make good come about despite it.
Yes. No, I mean, the world's still infinite. The future is still infinite in possibility. You don't know. You don't know. And plus, struggle and strife aren't bad necessarily. I mean, they're not evil.
Yeah.
We know that. There's nothing actually evil about struggle and strife. We'll work together and we'll solve it. Simple as.
Well, it's like Ivan Ilin said that evil isn't the cut itself; it's the intentions that cause the cut.
Mm-hmm.
So, again, you might have to struggle, but that is not bad in itself. And I think, like I was saying, to lament isn't to cry and shit your pants over it. It's to recognize that there is like a necessity about the situation. We're here now. We couldn't prevent that. We can recognize how that played out and then pick up the strands that are there for us and then sort of pull the ship in a new direction.
Man, you killed me there. That's because Grant's got that line. Grant's got that line there. Like, to lament is not something. I thought you were going to start reciting. And you're like, I just imagine George. So I imagine George Grant like opening up the book. To lament is not to cry and shit your pants. Come a little. Man, fuck. That got me. That was good.
Nice. Yeah, well, so at the end of the day, the Canadian black pillars whining about Canadians being the perfect last man. Like, shut up, you're fucking wrong. You're an idiot.
Well, let's get
sorry. Not sorry.
Yeah, not sorry.
Shut up. Fucking.
I couldn't remember who I said that to, and now I do, and we should have him on the show.
We can have him on the show, yeah.
Yeah. I might take him to task over that. All right. Well, we'll say goodbye to you. Well, I will do a little outro, so we'll be right back in 10 seconds. Well, 0 for you. Okay, bye. Well, we finally did Lament for a Nation. That's usually episode 1 of most Canadian podcasts.
Yeah,
it ought to be.
Yeah, it's something that people hit on right off the bat. I don't know, we got it now, and I think it was good that we did it later because we brought so many other factors in. I think I don't know. I like the way it came out. I like the tools that we're able to use and the lenses that we're able to place over it.
I'm glad you did that for me because like I said, I didn't necessarily, at least instantly, get too much new out of it. But then once we were talking about it, I'm like, yeah, I guess I did. So yeah, it's good. The older my brain gets, you got your 10 years younger than me. You still got a lot of versatility and connective tissue in your brain. It's not all calcified and worn down by case after case of old Milwaukee. I feel like I used to be able to think like that more. Now my brain's a lot quieter. It doesn't connect things as much.
It's smoother.
No, it's quite a bit smoother. Like it's rain runs right off it like a duck's back, I'd like to. I am actually legitimately a lot stupider than I was 15 years ago, and I can tell when I read my old book. But then on the other hand, I'm much smarter in many ways. Like my brain, I had so many connections and bright ideas and things when I was a kid. But then the book I wrote was absolutely idiotic in sentiment and actual character. And now I feel like if I wrote something, it'd be a lot more simple and maybe less intellectually stimulating, but it would actually probably at least be right. It'd be righter. Mm-hmm. Anyway, everyone has that to look forward to, and I think it only progresses as you get older.
Well, I mean, there's good things that come with that, I guess, and bad things, and just the way she goes, way the road.
Yeah. And then every now and then, like, I guess I haven't gone into a complete coma, because every now and then something sparks my imagination. I can still go off a little bit. So I don't know. Thanks to starting boxing and getting more in shape, I don't feel like old. When I turned 32, 33, I started just feeling really old all of a sudden. And like I'd wasted half my life, like kind of a little, not even midlife crisis, but and then getting healthy like cured that. But then now am I going to go through the same thing with my intellectual ability, which was never stellar to begin with, but at least it got me through the day. I don't know.
I feel like you get smarter for a bit. I don't know. I have no experience at that age, but I feel like I don't know, something will happen. You'll be like, whoa, I'm getting more. You read more, you'll dial in on some of these topics at a different level, and then you'll surprise yourself.
I read literally, at least an order of magnitude less than I did when I like 10, 15 years ago.
Really?
Oh, I probably read thanks to podcasts now, I've read a few books in the last few weeks, but probably only read a couple books a year for the last few years. And when I was a kid, I would read probably 100 books a year, easy.
Ah.
Like, I mean kid up to like 22, 3.
I see.
Yeah, I don't know.
I don't know what to tell you, man. You'll be fine. Just go with the flow.
Yeah. Well, it's okay if I get dumber too. I'll try and be one of those happy dumb people.
I don't know. You'll still be smarter than 75%, 80% of the population. So.
Well, I'll be more white and more fascist, and that's really what counts.
Whatever floats your goat.
I'm gonna cut the outro because I don't want to lament my fucking brain function. Oh, okay. That's a good joke. I'm not gonna cut the outro now. Lament for my brain function. Okay, see ya.
See ya.